Book 3, Chapter 5. Madame de Plogastel. The postilion drew rein, and the footman opened the door, letting down the steps and proffering his arm to his mistress, to assist her to alight, since that was the wish she had expressed. Then he opened one wing of the iron gates and held it for her. She was a woman of something more than 40, who once must have been very lovely, who was very lovely still, with the refining quality that age brings to some women. Her dress and carriage alike advertised great rank. "I take my leave here, since you have a visitor," said Andre-Louis. "But it is an old acquaintance of your own, Andre. You remember Madame la Comtesse de Plogastel." He looked at the approaching lady, whom Aline was now hastening forward to meet, and because she was named to him, he recognized her. He must, he thought, had he but looked, have recognized her without prompting anywhere at any time, and this although it was some 16 years since last he had seen her. The sight of her now brought it all back to him, a treasured memory that had never permitted itself to be entirely overlaid by subsequent events. When he was a boy of 10, on the eve of being sent to school at Rennes, she had come on a visit to his godfather, who was her cousin. It happened that at the time he had been taken by Rabouillet to the manor of Gavrillac, and there he had been presented to Madame de Plogastel, the great lady in all the glory then of her youthful beauty, with her gentle, cultured voice, so cultured that she had seemed to speak a language almost unknown to the little Breton lad, and her majestic air of the great world had scared him a little at first. Very gently had she allayed those fears of his, and by some mysterious enchantment she had completely enslaved his regard. He recalled now the terror in which he had gone to the embrace to which he was bidden, and the subsequent reluctance with which he had left those soft, round arms. He remembered, too, how sweetly she had smelled, and the very perfume she had used, a perfume as of lilac, for memory is singularly tenacious in these matters. For 3 days, whilst she had been at Gavrillac, he had gone daily to the manor, and so had spent hours in her company. A childless woman with the maternal instinct strong within her, she had taken this precociously intelligent, wide-eyed lad to her heart. "Give him to me, Cousin Quentin," he remembered her saying on the last of those days to his godfather. "Let me take him back with me to Versailles as my adopted child." But the seigneur had gravely shaken his head in silent refusal, and there had been no further question of such a thing. And then, when she said good-bye to him, the thing came flooding back to him now. There had been tears in her eyes. "Think of me sometimes, Andre-Louis," had been her last words. He remembered how flattered he had been to have won within so short a time the affection of this great lady. The thing had given him a sense of importance that had endured for months thereafter, finally to fade into oblivion. But all was vividly remembered now upon beholding her again, after 16 years, profoundly changed and matured. The girl, for she had been no more in those old days, sunk in this worldly woman, with the air of calm dignity and complete self-possession. Yet, he insisted, he must have known her anywhere again. Aline embraced her affectionately, and then answering the questioning glance with faintly raised eyebrows that Madame was directing toward Aline's companion. "This is Andre-Louis," she said. "You remember Andre-Louis, Madame?" Madame checked. Andre-Louis saw the surprise ripple over her face, taking with it some of her colour, leaving her for a moment breathless. And then the voice, the well-remembered, rich, musical voice, richer and deeper now than of yore, repeated his name. Andre-Louis. Her manner of uttering it suggested that it awakened memories. Memories, perhaps, of the departed youth with which it was associated. And she paused a long moment, considering him, a little wide-eyed, what time he bowed before her. "But of course I remember him," she said at last, and came towards him, putting out her hand. He kissed it dutifully, submissively, instinctively. "And this is what you have grown into?" She appraised him, and he flushed with pride at the satisfaction in her tone. He seemed to have gone back 16 years and to be again the little Breton lad at Gavrillac. She turned to Aline. How mistaken Quentin was in his assumptions. He was pleased to see him again, was he not? "So pleased, madame, that he has shown me the door," said Andre-Louis. "Ah!" she frowned, conning him still with those dark, wistful eyes of hers. "We must change that, Aline. He is, of course, very angry with you. But it is not the way to make converts. I will plead for you, Andre-Louis. I am a good advocate." He thanked her and took his leave. "I leave my case in your hands with gratitude. My homage, madam." And so it happened that in spite of his godfather's forbidding reception of him, the fragment of a song was on his lips as his yellow chaise whirled him back to Paris and the Rue de Hussard. That meeting with Madame de Plougastel had enheartened him. Her promise to plead his case in alliance with Aline gave him assurance that all would be well. That he was justified of this was proven when on the following Thursday towards noon his academy was invaded by Monsieur de Kercadiou. Giles, the boy, brought him word of it, and breaking off at once the lesson upon which he was engaged, he pulled off his mask and went as he was, in a chamois waistcoat, buttoned to the chin, and with his foil under his arm, to the modest salon below, where his godfather awaited him. The florid little Lord of Gavrillac stood almost defiantly to receive him. "I have been over-persuaded to forgive you," he announced aggressively, seeming thereby to imply that he consented to this merely so as to put an end to tiresome importunities. Andre-Louis was not misled. He detected a pretense adopted by the seigneur so as to enable him to retreat in good order. "My blessings on the persuaders, whoever they may have been. You restore me my happiness, monsieur my godfather." He took the hand that was proffered and kissed it, yielding to the impulse of the unfailing habit of his boyish days. It was an act symbolical of his complete submission, re-establishing between himself and his godfather the bond of protected and protector, with all the mutual claims and duties that it carries. No mere words could more completely have made his peace with this man who loved him. Monsieur de Kercadiou's face flushed a deeper pink. His lip trembled, and there was a huskiness in the voice that murmured, "My dear boy." Then he recollected himself, threw back his great head, and frowned. His voice resumed its habitual shrillness. "You realize, I hope, that you have behaved damnably, and with the utmost ingratitude." "Does not that depend upon the point of view?" quoth Andre-Louis, but his tone was studiously conciliatory. "It depends upon a fact, and not upon any point of view. Since I have been persuaded to overlook it, I trust that at least you have some intention of reforming." I will abstain from politics," said Andre-Louis, that being the utmost he could say with truth. "That is something, at least." His godfather permitted himself to be mollified, now that a concession, or a seeming concession, had been made to his just resentment. "A chair, monsieur?" No. I have come to carry you off to pay a visit with me. You owe it entirely to Madame de Plougastel that I consent to receive you again. I desire that you come with me to thank her." "I have my engagements here," began Andre-Louis, and then broke off. "No matter. I will arrange it. A moment." And he was turning away to re-enter the academy. "What are your engagements? You are not by chance a fencing instructor?" Monsieur de Kercadiou had observed the leather waistcoat and the foil tucked under Andre-Louis' arm. "I am the master of this academy, the academy of the late Bertrand des Amis, the most flourishing school of arms in Paris today." Monsieur de Kercadiou's brows went up. "And you are the master of it?" "Maître en fait d'armes. I succeeded to the academy upon the death of des Amis." He left Monsieur Kercadiou to think it over, and went to make his arrangements and effect the necessary changes in his toilette. "So that is why you have taken to wearing a sword," said Monsieur de Kercadiou as they climbed into his waiting carriage. "That, and the need to guard oneself in these times." "And do you mean to tell me that a man who lives by what is, after all, an honourable profession, a profession mainly supported by the nobility, can at the same time associate himself with these peddling attorneys and low pamphleteers who are spreading dissension and insubordination?" "You forget that I am a peddling attorney myself, made so by your own wishes, monsieur." Monsieur de Kercadiou grunted and took snuff. "You say the academy flourishes?" he asked presently. "It does. I have 2 assistant instructors. I could employ a 3rd. It is hard work." "That should mean that your circumstances are affluent." "I have reason to be satisfied. I have far more than I need." "Then you'll be able to do your share in paying off this national debt," growled the nobleman, well content that, as he conceived it, some of the evil Andre-Louis had helped to sow should recoil upon him. Then the talk veered to Madame de Plougastel. Monsieur de Kercadiou, Andre-Louis gathered, but not the reason for it, disapproved most strongly of this visit. But then Madame la Comtesse was a headstrong woman, whom there was no denying, whom all the world obeyed. Monsieur de Plougastel was at present absent in Germany, but would shortly be returning. It was an indiscreet admission from which it was easy to infer that Monsieur de Plougastel was one of those intriguing emissaries who came and went between the Queen of France and her brother, the Emperor of Austria. The carriage drew up before a handsome hotel in the Faubourg Saint-Denis, at the corner of the Rue Paradis, and they were ushered by a sleek servant into a little boudoir, all gilt and brocade, that opened upon a terrace above a garden that was a park in miniature. Here Madame awaited them. She rose, dismissing the young person who had been reading to her, and came forward with both hands outheld to greet her cousin Kercadiou. "I almost feared you would not keep your word," she said. "It was unjust. But then I hardly hoped that you would succeed in bringing him." And her glance, gentle and smiling welcome upon him, indicated Andre-Louis. The young man made answer with formal gallantry. "The memory of you, madame, is too deeply imprinted on my heart for any persuasions to have been necessary." "Ah, the courtier," said madame, and abandoned him her hand. "We are to have a little talk, Andre-Louis," she informed him with a gravity that left him vaguely ill at ease. They sat down, and for a while the conversation was of general matters, chiefly concerned, however, with Andre-Louis, his occupations, and his views. And all the while Madame was studying him attentively, with those gentle, wistful eyes, until again that sense of uneasiness began to pervade him. He realized instinctively that he had been brought here for some purpose deeper than that which had been avowed. At last, as if the thing were concerted, and the clumsy Lord of Gavrillac was the last man in the world to cover his tracks, his godfather rose, and, upon a pretext of desiring to survey the garden, sauntered through the windows onto the terrace, over whose white stone balustrade the geraniums trailed in a scarlet riot. Thence he vanished among the foliage below. "Now we can talk more intimately," said Madame. "Come here and sit beside me." She indicated the empty half of the settee she occupied. Andre-Louis went obediently, but a little uncomfortably. "You know," she said gently, placing a hand upon his arm, "that you have behaved very ill, that your godfather's resentment is very justly founded." "Madame, if I knew that, I should be the most unhappy, the most despairing of men." And he explained himself, as he had explained himself on Sunday to his godfather. "What I did because it was the only means to my hand in a country in which justice was paralyzed by privilege, to make war upon an infamous scoundrel who had killed my best friend, a wanton, brutal act of murder, which there was no law to punish. And as if that were not enough, forgive me if I speak with the utmost frankness, madam, he afterwards debauched the woman I was to have married." "Ah, mon Dieu!" she cried out. "Forgive me. I know that it is horrible. You perceive, perhaps, what I suffered, how I came to be driven. That last affair of which I am guilty, the riot that began in the Feydeau Theatre and afterwards enveloped the whole city of Nantes, was provoked by this." "Who was she, this girl?" It was like a woman, he thought, to fasten upon the unessential. "Oh, a theatre girl, a poor fool of whom I have no regrets. La Binet was her name. I was a player at the time in her father's troupe. That was after the Rennes business, when it was necessary to hide from such justice as exists in France, the gallows justice for unfortunates who are not born. This added wrong led me to provoke a riot in the theatre." "Poor boy," she said tenderly. "Only a woman's heart can realize what you must have suffered, and because of that I can so readily forgive you. But now..." "Ah, but you don't understand, madame. If today I thought that I had none but personal grounds for having lent a hand in the holy work of abolishing privilege, I think I should cut my throat. My true justification lies in the insincerity of those who intended that the convocation of the States General should be a sham, mere dust in the eyes of the nation. Was it not, perhaps, wise to have been insincere in such a matter?" He looked at her blankly. "Can it ever be wise, madam, to be insincere?" "Oh, indeed it can. Believe me, who am twice your age, and know my world." "I should say, madam, that nothing is wise that complicates existence, and I know of nothing that so complicates it as insincerity. Consider a moment the complications that have arisen out of this." "But surely, Andre-Louis, your views have not been so perverted that you do not see that a governing class is a necessity in any country." "Why, of course, but not necessarily a hereditary one." "What else?" He answered her with an epigram. "Man, madam, is the child of his own work. Let there be no inheriting of rights but from such a parent. Thus a nation's best will always predominate, and such a nation will achieve greatly." "But do you account birth of no importance?" "Of none, madam, or else my own might trouble me." From the deep flush that stained her face, he feared that he had offended by what was almost an indelicacy. But the reproof that he was expecting did not come. Instead, "And does it not?" she asked. "Never, Andre?" "Never, madame. I am content." "You have never regretted your lack of parents' care?" He laughed, sweeping aside her sweet, charitable concern that was so superfluous. "On the contrary, madame, I tremble to think what they might have made of me, and I am grateful to have had the fashioning of myself." She looked at him for a moment very sadly, and then, smiling, gently shook her head. "You do not want self-satisfaction. Yet I could wish that you saw things differently, Andre. It is a moment of great opportunities for a young man of talent and spirit. I could help you. I could help you, perhaps, to go very far, if you would permit yourself to be helped after my fashion." "Yes," he thought, "help me to a halter by sending me on treasonable missions to Austria on the Queen's behalf, like Monsieur de Plougastel. That would certainly end in a high position for me." Aloud, he answered more as politeness prompted. "I am grateful, madame, but you will see that, holding the ideals I have expressed, I could not serve any cause that is opposed to their realization." "You are misled by prejudice, Andre-Louis, by personal grievances. Will you allow them to stand in the way of your advancement?" "If what I call ideals were really prejudices, would it be honest of me to run counter to them whilst holding them?" "If I could convince you that you are mistaken, I could help you so much to find a worthy employment for the talents you possess. In the service of the king, you would prosper quickly. Will you think of it, Andre-Louis, and let us talk of this again?" He answered her with formal, chill politeness. "I fear that it would be idle, madam. Yet your interest in me is very flattering, and I thank you. It is unfortunate for me that I am so headstrong." "And now who deals in insincerity?" she asked him. "Ah, but you see, madame, it is an insincerity that does not mislead." And then M. de Kercadiou came in through the window again, and announced fussily that he must be getting back to Meudon, and that he would take his godson with him and set him down at the Rue du Hasard. "You must bring him again, Quintin," the Countess said, as they took their leave of her. "Some day, perhaps," said M. de Kercadiou vaguely, and swept his godson out. In the carriage he asked him bluntly of what Madame had talked. "She was very kind, a sweet woman," said Andre-Louis pensively. "Devil take you! I didn't ask you the opinion that you presume to have formed of her. I asked you what she said to you." "She strove to point out to me the error of my ways. She spoke of great things that I might do, to which she would very kindly help me, if I were to come to my senses. But as miracles do not happen, I gave her little encouragement to hope." I see. Did she say anything else?" He was so peremptory that Andre-Louis turned to look at him. "What else did you expect her to say, monsieur my godfather?" "Oh, nothing." "Then she fulfilled your expectations?" "Eh? Oh, 1,000 devils! Why can't you express yourself in a sensible manner that a plain man can understand without having to think about it?" He sulked after that most of the way to the Rue du Hasard, or so it seemed to Andre-Louis. At least he sat silent, gloomily thoughtful, to judge by his expression. "You may come and see us soon again at Meudon," he told Andre-Louis at parting. "But please remember, no revolutionary politics in future, if we are to remain friends." Book 3, Chapter 6. Politicians. One morning in August, the Academy in the Rue du Hasard was invaded by Le Chapelier, accompanied by a man of remarkable appearance, whose Herculean stature and disfigured countenance seemed vaguely familiar to Andre-Louis. He was a man of little, if anything, over 30, with small, bright eyes buried in an enormous face. His cheekbones were prominent, his nose awry, as if it had been broken by a blow, and his mouth was rendered almost shapeless by the scars of another injury. A bull had horned him in the face when he was but a lad. As if that were not enough to render his appearance terrible, his cheeks were deeply pockmarked. He was dressed untidily in a long scarlet coat that descended almost to his ankles, soiled buckskin breeches and boots with reversed tops. His shirt, none too clean, was open at the throat, the collar hanging limply over an unknotted cravat, displaying fully the muscular neck that rose like a pillar from his massive shoulders. He swung a cane that was almost a club in his left hand, and there was a cockade in his biscuit-coloured conical hat. He carried himself with an aggressive, masterful air, that great head of his thrown back, as if he were eternally at defiance. Le Chapelier, whose manner was very grave, named him to Andre-Louis. "This is Monsieur Danton, president of the Cordeliers, of whom you will have heard." Of course, Andre-Louis had heard of him. Who had not by then? Looking at him now with interest, Andre-Louis wondered how it came that all, or nearly all, the leading innovators were pockmarked. Mirabeau, the journalist Desmoulins, the philanthropist Marat, Robespierre, the little lawyer from Arras, this formidable fellow Danton, and several others he could call to mind, all bore upon them the scars of smallpox. Almost he began to wonder, was there any connection between the two? Did an attack of smallpox produce certain moral results which found expression in this way? He dismissed the idle speculation, or rather it was shattered by the startling thunder of Danton's voice. "This, expletive deleted, Chapelier has told me of you. He says that you are a patriotic, expletive deleted." More than by the tone was Andre-Louis startled by the obscenities with which the Colossus did not hesitate to interlard his first speech to a total stranger. He laughed outright. There was nothing else to do. "If he has told you that, he has told you more than the truth. I am a patriot. The rest my modesty compels me to disavow." "You are a joker, too, it seems," roared the other. But he laughed nevertheless, and the volume of it shook the windows. "There's no offence in me. I am like that." "What a pity," said Andre-Louis. It disconcerted the king of the markets. "Eh? What's this Chapelier? Does he give himself airs, your friend here?" The spruce Breton, a very petit maître in appearance by contrast with his companion, but nevertheless of a downright manner quite equal to Danton's in brutality, though dispensing with the emphasis of foulness, shrugged as he answered him. "It is merely that he doesn't like your manners, which is not at all surprising. They are execrable." "Ah, bah! You are all like that, you Bretons. Let's come to business. You'll have heard what took place in the Assembly yesterday. You haven't? My God, where do you live? Have you heard that this scoundrel, who calls himself King of France, gave passage across French soil the other day to Austrian troops going to crush those who fight for liberty in Belgium? Have you heard that by any chance?" "Yes," said Andre-Louis coldly, masking his irritation before the other's hectoring manner. "I have heard that." "Oh, and what do you think of it?" Arms akimbo, the Colossus towered above him. Andre-Louis turned aside to Le Chapelier. "I don't think I understand. Have you brought this gentleman here to examine my conscience?" "Name of name! He's prickly as a porcupine!" Danton protested. "No, no." Le Chapelier was conciliatory, seeking to provide an antidote to the irritant administered by his companion. "We require your help, Andre. Danton here thinks that you are the very man for us. Listen now." "That's it, you tell him," Danton agreed. "You both talk the same mincing sort of French. He'll probably understand you." Le Chapelier went on without heeding the interruption. "This violation by the king of the obvious rights of a country engaged in framing a constitution that shall make it free has shattered every philanthropic illusion we still cherished. There are those who go so far as to proclaim the king the vowed enemy of France, but that, of course, is excessive." "Who says so?" blazed Danton, and swore horribly by way of conveying his total disagreement. Le Chapelier waved him into silence and proceeded. "Anyhow, the matter has been more than enough, added to all the rest, to set us by the ears again in the Assembly. It is open war between the Third Estate and the privileged." "Was it ever anything else?" "Perhaps not, but it has assumed a new character. You'll have heard of the duel between Lameth and the Duc de Castries." "A trifling affair." "In its results, but it might have been far other. Mirabeau is challenged and insulted now at every sitting, but he goes his way cold-bloodedly wise. Others are not so circumspect. They meet insult with insult, blow with blow, and blood is being shed in private duels. The thing is reduced by these swordsmen of the nobility to a system." Andre-Louis nodded. He was thinking of Philippe de Vilmorin. "Yes," he said. "It is an old trick of theirs. It is so simple and direct, like themselves. I wonder only that they didn't hit upon this system sooner. In the early days of the States General, at Versailles, it might have had a better effect. Now it comes a little late." "But they mean to make up for lost time, sacred name!" cried Danton. "Challenges are flying right and left between these bully swordsmen, these spadacinicides, and poor devils of the robe who have never learnt to fence with anything but a quill. It's just murder. Yet if I were to go amongst Messieurs les Nobles and crunch an addled head or two with this stick of mine, snap a few aristocratic necks between these fingers which the good God has given me for the purpose, the law would send me to atone upon the gallows. This in a land that is striving after liberty. Why, Dieu, madame, I am not even allowed to keep my hat on in the theatre, but these... Expletive deleted. "He is right," said Le Chapelier. "The thing has become unendurable, insufferable. 2 days ago, M. d'Amblay threatened Mirabeau with his cane before the whole assembly. Yesterday, M. de Faucigny leapt up and harangued his order by inviting murder. 'Why don't we fall on these scoundrels sword in hand?' he asked. Those were his very words. 'Why don't we fall on these scoundrels sword in hand?'" "It is so much simpler than law-making," said Andre-Louis. "Lagron, the deputy from Ancenis in the Loire, said something that we did not hear in answer. As he was leaving the manege, one of these bullies grossly insulted him. Legrand no more than used his elbow to push past when the fellow cried out that he had been struck and issued his challenge. They fought this morning early in the Champs-Élysées, and Legrand was killed, run through the stomach deliberately by a man who fought like a fencing master. And poor Legrand did not even own a sword. He had to borrow one to go to the assignation." Andre-Louis, his mind ever on Vilmorin, whose case was here repeated even to the details, was swept by a gust of passion. He clenched his hands and his jaws set. Danton's little eyes observed him keenly. "Well, and what do you think of that? Noblesse oblige, eh? The thing is, we must oblige them too, these..." Expletive deleted. "We must pay them back in the same coin. Meet them with the same weapons. Abolish them. Tumble these assassinatures into the abyss of nothingness by the same means." "But how?" "How? Name of God! Haven't I said it?" "This is where we require your help," Le Chapelier put in. "There must be men of patriotic feeling among the more advanced of your pupils. Monsieur Danton's idea is that a little band of these, say a half-dozen, with yourself at their head, might read these bullies a sharp lesson." Andre-Louis frowned. "And how precisely had Monsieur Danton thought that this might be done. Monsieur Danton spoke for himself vehemently.
"Why, thus. We post you in the manege at the hour when the assembly is rising. We point out the 6 leading phlebotomists, and let you loose to insult them before they have time to insult any of the representatives. Then, tomorrow morning, 6 phlebotomists, themselves phlebotomized secundum artem. That will give the others something to think about. It will give them a great deal to think about by...
Expletive deleted.
If necessary, the dose may be repeated to ensure a cure. If you kill the...
Expletive deleted.
So much the better."
He paused, his sallow face flushed with the enthusiasm of his idea. Andre-Louis stared at him inscrutably.
"Well, what do you say to that?"
"That it is most ingenious." And Andre-Louis turned aside to look out of the window.
"And is that all you think of it?"
"I will not tell you what else I think of it, because you probably would not understand. For you, Monsieur Danton, there is at least this excuse that you did not know me. But you, Isaac, to bring this gentleman here with such a proposal..." Le Chapelier was overwhelmed in confusion. "I confess I hesitated," he apologized. "But Monsieur Danton would not take my word for it that the proposal might not be to your taste."
"I would not!"
Danton broke in, bellowing. He swung upon Le Chapelier, brandishing his great arms.
"You told me that Monsieur was a patriot. Patriotism knows no scruples. You call this mincing, dancing master a patriot?"
"Would you, monsieur, out of patriotism, consent to become an assassin?"
"Of course I would. Haven't I told you so? Haven't I told you that I would gladly go among them with my club and crack them like so many fleas?"
"Why not, then?"
"Why not? Because I should get myself hanged. Haven't I said so?"
"But what of that? Being a patriot. Why not, like another Curtius, jump into the gulf, since you believe that your country would benefit by your death?" Monsieur Danton showed signs of exasperation.
"Because my country will benefit more by my life."
"Permit me, monsieur, to suffer from a similar vanity."
"You? But where would be the danger to you? You would do your work under the cloak of dueling, as they do."
"Have you reflected, monsieur, that the law will hardly regard a fencing master who kills his opponent as an ordinary combatant, particularly if it can be shown that the fencing master himself provoked the attack?"
"So, name of name!"
Monsieur Danton blew out his cheeks and delivered himself with withering scorn.
"It comes to this, then. You are afraid."
"You may think so if you choose. That I am afraid to do slyly and treacherously that which a thrasonical patriot like yourself is afraid of doing frankly and openly. I have other reasons, but that one should suffice you." Danton gasped. Then he swore more amazingly and variedly than ever.
"By..."
Expletive deleted.
"You are right,"
he admitted, to Andre-Louis' amazement.
"You are right, and I am wrong. I am as bad a patriot as you are, and I am a coward as well."
And he invoked the whole pantheon to witness his self-denunciation.
"Only, you see, I count for something, and if they take me and hang me, why, there it is. Monsieur, we must find some other way. Forgive the intrusion. Adieu!"
He held out his enormous hand. Le Chapelier stood hesitating, crestfallen. "You understand, Andre. I am sorry that..." "Say no more, please. Come and see me soon again. I would press you to remain, but it is striking 9, and the first of my pupils is about to arrive."
"Nor would I permit it," said Danton. "Between us, we must resolve the riddle of how to extinguish Monsieur de La Tour d'Azyr and his friends."
"Who?" Sharp as a pistol shot came that question as Danton was turning away. The tone of it brought him up short. He turned again, Le Chapelier with him.
"I said Monsieur de La Tour d'Azyr."
"What has he to do with the proposal you were making me?"
"He? Why, he is the phlebotomist-in-chief."
And Le Chapelier added, "It is he who killed Legrand."
"Not a friend of yours, is he?" wondered Danton.
"And it is La Tour d'Azyr you desire me to kill?" asked Andre-Louis very slowly, after the manner of one whose thoughts are meanwhile pondering the subject.
"That's it," said Danton. "And not a job for a prentice hand, I can assure you."
"Ah, but this alters things," said Andre-Louis, thinking aloud. "It offers a great temptation."
"Why, then..."
The Colossus took a step towards him again. "Wait." He put up his hand. Then, with chin sunk on his breast, he paced away to the window, musing. Le Chapelier and Danton exchanged glances, then watched him, waiting, what time he considered. At first he almost wondered why he should not, of his own accord, have decided upon some such course as this to settle that long-standing account of Monsieur de La Tour d'Azyr. What was the use of this great skill in fence that he had come to acquire, unless he could turn it to account to avenge Vilmorin, and to make Aline safe from the lure of her own ambition? It would be an easy thing to seek out La Tour d'Azyr, put a mortal affront upon him, and thus bring him to the point. Today this would be murder. Murder as treacherous as that which La Tour d'Azyr had done upon Philippe de Vilmorin. For today the old positions were reversed, and it was Andre-Louis who might go to such an assignation without a doubt of the issue. It was a moral obstacle of which he made short work. But there remained the legal obstacle he had expounded to Danton. There was still a law in France, the same law which he had found it impossible to move against La Tour d'Azyr, but which would move briskly enough against himself in like case. And then, suddenly, as if by inspiration, he saw the way, a way which, if adopted, would probably bring La Tour d'Azyr to a poetic justice, bring him, insolent, confident, to thrust himself upon Andre-Louis' sword, with all the odium of provocation on his own side. He turned to them again, and they saw that he was very pale, that his great dark eyes glowed oddly. "There will probably be some difficulty in finding a suppliant for this poor Legrand," he said. "Our fellow countrymen will be none so eager to offer themselves to the swords of privilege." "True enough," said Le Chapelier gloomily, and then, as if suddenly leaping to the thing in Andre-Louis' mind, "Andre!" he cried. "Would you?" "It is what I was considering. It would give me a legitimate place in the Assembly. If your Tour d'Azyrs choose to seek me out then, why, their blood will be upon their own heads. I shall certainly do nothing to discourage them." He smiled curiously. I am just a rascal who tries to be honest. Scaramouche always, in fact. A creature of sophistries. Do you think that Ancenis would have me for its representative?
Will it have omnes omnibus for its representative?
Le Chapelier was laughing, his countenance eager.
Ancenis will be convulsed with pride. It is not Rennes or Nantes, as it might have been had you wished it, but it gives you a voice for Brittany.
I should have to go to Ancenis.
No need at all.
A letter from me to the municipality, and the municipality will confirm you at once. No need to move from here. In a fortnight at most the thing can be accomplished. It is settled then. Andre-Louis considered yet a moment. There was his academy, but he could make arrangements with Leduc and Galoche to carry it on for him whilst himself directing and advising. Leduc, after all, was become a thoroughly efficient master, and he was a trustworthy fellow. At need, a third assistant could be engaged. "Be it so," he said at last. Le Chapelier clasped hands with him, and became congratulatorily voluble, until interrupted by the red-coated giant at the door.
"What exactly does it mean to our business, anyway?" he asked. "Does it mean that when you are a representative you will not scruple to skewer Monsieur le Marquis?"
"If Monsieur le Marquis should offer himself to be skewered, as he no doubt will."
"I perceive the distinction," said Monsieur Danton, and sneered. "You've an ingenious mind."
He turned to Le Chapelier.
"What did you say he was, to begin with? A lawyer, wasn't it?"
"Yes, I was a lawyer, and afterwards a mountebank."
"And this is the result?"
"As you say. And do you know that we are, after all, not so dissimilar, you and I?"
"What?"
"Once, like you, I went about inciting other people to go and kill the man I wanted dead. You'll say I was a coward, of course." Le Chapelier prepared to slip between them as the clouds gathered on the giant's brow. Then these were dispelled again, and the great laugh vibrated through the long room.
"You've touched me for the second time, and in the same place. Oh, you can fence, my lad. We should be friends. Rue de Cordeliers is my address. Any expletive deleted scoundrel will tell you where Danton lodges. Desmoulins lives underneath. Come and visit us one evening. There's always a bottle for a friend."
Book 3, Chapter 7. The Spadacinicides. After an absence of rather more than a week, Monsieur le Marquis de la Tour d'Azyr was back in his place on the Côte d'Oie of the National Assembly. Properly speaking, we should already at this date allude to him as the ci-devant Marquis de la Tour d'Azyr. For the time was September of 1790, 2 months after the passing, on the motion of that downright Breton leveller Le Chapelier, of the decree that nobility should no more be hereditary than infamy, that just as the brand of the gallows must not defile the possibly worthy descendants of one who had been convicted of evil, neither should the blazon advertising achievement glorify the possibly unworthy descendants of one who had proved himself good. And so the decree had been passed, abolishing hereditary nobility and consigning family escutcheons to the rubbish heap of things no longer to be tolerated by an enlightened generation of philosophers. Monsieur le Comte de Lafayette, who had supported the motion, left the Assembly as plain Monsieur Motier. The great tribune, Count Mirabeau, became plain Monsieur Rigetti, and Monsieur le Marquis de la Tour d'Azyr just simple Monsieur Lesarques. The thing was done in one of those exaltations produced by the approach of the great national festival of the Champ de Mars, and no doubt it was thoroughly repented on the morrow by those who had lent themselves to it. Thus, although law by now, it was a law that no one troubled just yet to enforce. That, however, is by the way. The time, as I have said, was September, the day dull and showery, and some of the damp and gloom of it seemed to have penetrated the long hall of the manège, where, on their 8 rows of green benches, elliptically arranged in ascending tiers about the space known as la piste, sat some 800 or 900 of the representatives of the 3 orders that composed the nation. The matter under debate by the Constitution builders was whether the deliberating body to succeed the Constituent Assembly should work in conjunction with the King, whether it should be periodic or permanent, whether it should govern by 2 chambers or by 1. The Abbé Moreau, son of a cobbler, and therefore, in these days of antitheses, orator-in-chief of the party of the right, the Blacks, as those who fought privileges losing battles were known, was in the tribune. He appeared to be urging the adoption of a 2-chambers system framed on the English model. He was, if anything, more long-winded and prosy even than his habit. His arguments assumed more and more the form of a sermon. The tribune of the National Assembly became more and more like a pulpit. But the members, conversely, less and less like a congregation. They grew restive under that steady flow of pompous verbiage, and it was in vain that the 4 ushers in black satin breeches and carefully powdered heads, chain of office on their breasts, gilded swords at their sides, circulated in the piste, clapping their hands and hissing, "Silence! En place!" Equally vain was the intermittent ringing of the bell by the president at his green-covered table facing the tribune. The Abbé Moreau had talked too long, and for some time had failed to interest the members. Realizing it at last, he ceased, whereupon the hum of conversation became general. And then it fell abruptly. There was a silence of expectancy and a turning of heads, a craning of necks. Even the group of secretaries at the round table below the president's dais roused themselves from their usual apathy to consider this young man who was mounting the tribune of the Assembly for the first time. Monsieur Andre-Louis Moreau, Deputy Suppleant, Vice Emmanuel Legrand, deceased, for Ancenis in the department of the Loire. Monsieur de la Tour d'Azyr shook himself out of the gloomy abstraction in which he had sat. The successor of the deputy he had slain must, in any event, be an object of grim interest to him. You conceive how that interest was heightened when he heard him named, when, looking across, he recognized indeed in this Andre-Louis Moreau the young scoundrel who was continually crossing his path, continually exerting against him a deep-moving, sinister influence to make him regret that he should have spared his life that day at Gavrillac 2 years ago, that he should thus have stepped into the shoes of Legrand, seemed to Monsieur de la Tour d'Azyr too apt for mere coincidence, a direct challenge in itself. He looked at the young man in wonder, rather than in anger, and looking at him, he was filled by a vague, almost premonitory uneasiness. At the very outset, the presence which in itself he conceived to be a challenge was to demonstrate itself for this in no equivocal terms. "I come before you," Andre-Louis began, "as a deputy suppliant to fill the place of one who was murdered some 3 weeks ago." It was a challenging opening that instantly provoked an indignant outcry from the blacks. Andre-Louis paused and looked at them, smiling a little, a singularly self-confident young man. "The gentlemen of the right, Monsieur le Président, do not appear to like my words. But that is not surprising. The gentlemen of the right notoriously do not like the truth." This time there was an uproar. The members of the left roared with laughter. Those of the right thundered menacingly. The ushers circulated at a pace beyond their usual, agitated themselves, clapped their hands, and called in vain for silence. The president rang his bell. Above the general din came the voice of La Tour d'Azyr, who had half risen from his seat. "Mountebank, this is not the theatre." "No, monsieur. It is becoming a hunting ground for bully swordsmen," was the answer, and the uproar grew. The deputy suppliant looked around and waited. Near at hand he met the encouraging grin of Le Chapelier and the quiet approving smile of Kersain, another Breton deputy of his acquaintance. A little farther off he saw the great head of Mirabeau thrown back, the great eyes regarding him from under a frown in a sort of wonder, and yonder, among all the moving sea of faces, the sallow countenance of the heiress's lawyer Robespierre, or de Robespierre, as the little snob now called himself, having assumed the aristocratic particle as the prerogative of a man of his distinction in the councils of his country. With his tip-tilted nose in the air, his carefully curled head on one side, the deputy for Arras was observing Andre-Louis attentively. The horn-rimmed spectacles he used for reading were thrust up on his pale forehead, and it was through a levelled spy-glass that he considered the speaker, his thin-lipped mouth stretched a little in that tiger-cat smile that was afterwards to become so famous and so feared. Gradually the uproar wore itself out and diminished, so that at last the president could make himself heard. Leaning forward, he gravely addressed the young man in the tribune. "Monsieur, if you wish to be heard, let me beg of you not to be provocative in your language." And then to the others, "Messieurs, if we are to proceed, I beg that you will restrain your feelings until the deputy suppliant has concluded his discourse." "I shall endeavour to obey, Monsieur le Président, leaving provocation to the gentlemen of the right. If the few words I have used so far have been provocative, I regret it, but it was necessary that I should refer to the distinguished deputy whose place I come so unworthily to fill, and it was unavoidable that I should refer to the event which has procured us this sad necessity. The deputy Legrand was a man of singular nobility of mind, a selfless, dutiful, zealous man, inflamed by the high purpose of doing his duty by his electors and by this assembly. He possessed what his opponents would call a dangerous gift of eloquence." La Tour d'Azyr writhed at the well-known phrase, his own phrase, the phrase that he had used to explain his action in the matter of Philippe de Vilmorin, the phrase that from time to time had been cast in his teeth with such vindictive menace. And then the crisp voice of the witty Canal, that very rapier of the privileged party, cut short into the speaker's momentary pause. "Monsieur le Président," he asked with great solemnity, "has the deputy suppleant mounted the tribune for the purpose of taking part in the debate on the constitution of the legislative assemblies, or for the purpose of pronouncing a funeral oration upon the departed deputy Legrand?" This time it was the blacks who gave way to mirth until checked by the deputy suppleant. "That laughter is obscene." In this truly Gallic fashion, he flung his glove into the face of privilege, determined, you see, upon no half measures, and the rippling laughter perished on the instant, quenched in speechless fury. Solemnly he proceeded. "You all know how Legrand died. To refer to his death at all requires courage. To laugh in referring to it requires something that I will not attempt to qualify. If I have alluded to his decease, it is because my own appearance among you seemed to render some such allusion necessary. It is mine to take up the burden which he set down. I do not pretend that I have the strength, the courage, or the wisdom of Legrand. But with every ounce of such strength and courage and wisdom as I possess, that burden will I bear. And I trust, for the sake of those who might attempt it, that the means taken to impose silence upon that eloquent voice will not be taken to impose silence upon mine." There was a faint murmur of applause from the left, splutter of contemptuous laughter from the right. "Rhodomont!" a voice called to him. He looked in the direction of that voice, proceeding from the group of spadasins amid the blacks across the piste, and he smiled. Inaudibly his lips answered, "No, my friend, Scaramouche, Scaramouche, the subtle, dangerous fellow who goes tortuously to his ends." Aloud he resumed, "Monsieur le Président, there are those who will not understand that the purpose for which we are assembled here is the making of laws by which France may be equitably governed, by which France may be lifted out of the morass of bankruptcy into which she is in danger of sinking. But there are some who want, it seems, not laws, but blood. I solemnly warn them that this blood will end by choking them, if they do not learn in time to discard force and allow reason to prevail." Again in that phrase there was something that stirred a memory in La Tour d'Azyr. He turned in the fresh uproar to speak to his cousin Chabrillane, who sat beside him. "A daring rogue, this bastard of Gavrillac's," said he. Chabrillane looked at him with gleaming eyes, his face white with anger. "Let him talk himself out. I don't think he will be heard again after today. Leave this to me." Hardly could La Tour have told you why, but he sank back in his seat with a sense of relief. He had been telling himself that here was a matter demanding action, a challenge that he must take up. But despite his rage, he felt a singular unwillingness. This fellow had a trick of reminding him, he supposed, too unpleasantly of that young abbé done to death in the garden behind the Breton arm at Gavrillac. Not that the death of Philippe de Vilmorin lay heavily upon M. de La Tour d'Azyr's conscience. He had accounted himself fully justified of his action. It was that the whole thing, as his memory revived it for him, made an unpleasant picture. That distraught boy kneeling over the bleeding body of the friend he had loved, and almost begging to be slain with him, dubbing the Marquis murderer and coward to incite him. Meanwhile, leaving now the subject of the death of Legrand, the deputy suppliant had at last brought himself into order and was speaking upon the question under debate. He contributed nothing of value to it. He urged nothing definite. His speech on the subject was very brief, that being the pretext and not the purpose for which he had ascended the tribune. When later he was leaving the hall at the end of the sitting, with Le Chapelier at his side, he found himself densely surrounded by deputies as by a bodyguard. Most of them were Bretons, who aimed at screening him from the provocations which his own provocative words in the assembly could not fail to bring down upon his head. For a moment the massive form of Mirabeau brought up alongside of him. "Felicitations, Monsieur Moreau," said the great man. "You acquitted yourself very well. They will want your blood, no doubt. But be discreet, monsieur, if I may presume to advise you, and do not allow yourself to be misled by any false sense of quixotry. Ignore their challenges. I do so myself. I place each challenger upon my list. There are some 50 there already, and there they will remain. Refuse them what they are pleased to call satisfaction, and all will be well." Andre-Louis smiled and sighed. "It requires courage," said the hypocrite. "Of course it does. But you would appear to have plenty." "Hardly enough, perhaps, but I shall do my best." They had come through the vestibule, and although this was lined with eager blacks waiting for the young man who had insulted them so flagrantly from the rostrum, Andre-Louis' bodyguard had prevented any of them from reaching him. Emerging now into the open under the great awning at the head of the carrière, erected to enable carriages to reach the door under cover, those in front of him dispersed a little, and there was a moment as he reached the limit of the awning when his front was entirely uncovered. Outside, the rain was falling heavily, churning the ground into thick mud, and for a moment Andre-Louis, with Le Chapelier ever at his side, stood hesitating to step out into the deluge. The watchful Chabrillane had seen his chance, and by a detour that took him momentarily out into the rain, he came face to face with the too daring young Breton. Rudely, violently, he thrust Andre-Louis back, as if to make room for himself under the shelter. Not for a second was Andre-Louis under any delusion as to the man's deliberate purpose, nor were those who stood near him, who made a belated and ineffectual attempt to close about him. He was grievously disappointed. It was not Chabrillane he had been expecting. His disappointment was reflected on his countenance, to be mistaken for something very different by the arrogant Chevalier. But if Chabrillane was the man appointed to deal with him, he would make the best of it. "I think you are pushing against me, monsieur," he said very civilly, and with elbow and shoulder he thrust M. de Chabrillane back into the rain. "I desire to take shelter, monsieur," the Chevalier hectored. "You may do so without standing on my feet. I have a prejudice against anyone standing on my feet. My feet are very tender. Perhaps you did not know it, monsieur. Please say no more." "Why, I wasn't speaking, you lout," exclaimed the Chevalier, slightly discomposed. "Were you not? I thought perhaps you were about to apologize."
"Apologize?" Chabrillane laughed. "To you? Do you know that you are amusing?"
He stepped under the awning for the second time, and again, in view of all, thrust Andre-Louis rudely back. "Ah!" cried Andre-Louis with a grimace. "You hurt me, monsieur. I have told you not to push against me." He raised his voice that all might hear him, and once more impelled M. de Chabrillane back into the rain. Now, for all his slenderness, his assiduous daily sword practice had given Andre-Louis an arm of iron. Also, he threw his weight into the thrust. His assailant reeled backwards a few steps, and then his heel struck a balk of timber left on the ground by some workman that morning, and he sat down suddenly in the mud. A roar of laughter rose from all who witnessed the fine gentleman's downfall. He rose, mud bespattered, in a fury, and in that fury sprang at Andre-Louis. Andre-Louis had made him ridiculous, which was altogether unforgivable. "You shall meet me for this," he spluttered. "I shall kill you for it." His inflamed face was within a foot of Andre-Louis'. Andre-Louis laughed. In the silence, everybody heard the laugh and the words that followed. "Oh, is that what you wanted? But why didn't you say so before? You would have spared me the trouble of knocking you down. I thought gentlemen of your profession invariably conducted these affairs with decency, decorum, and a certain grace. Had you done so, you might have saved your breeches." "How soon shall we settle this?" snapped Chabrillane, livid with real fury. "Whenever you please, monsieur. It is for you to say when it will suit your convenience to kill me. I think that was the intention you announced, was it not?" Andre-Louis was suavity itself. "Tomorrow morning, in the Bois, perhaps you will bring a friend." "Certainly, monsieur. Tomorrow morning, then. I hope we shall have fine weather. I detest the rain." Chabrillane looked at him almost with amazement. Andre-Louis smiled pleasantly. "Don't let me detain you now, monsieur. We quite understand each other. I shall be in the Bois at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." "That is too late for me, monsieur." "Any other hour would be too early for me. I do not like to have my habits disturbed. 9 o'clock or not at all, as you please." "But I must be at the Assembly at 9 for the morning session." "I am afraid, monsieur, you will have to kill me first, and I have a prejudice against being killed before 9 o'clock." Now this was too complete a subversion of the usual procedure for M. de Chabrillane's stomach. Here was a rustic deputy assuming with him precisely the tone of sinister mockery which his class usually dealt out to their victims of the Third Estate. And to heighten the irritation, Andre-Louis, the actor, Scaramouche always, produced his snuff-box and proffered it with a steady hand to Le Chapelier before helping himself. Chabrillane, it seemed, after all that he had suffered, was not even to be allowed to make a good exit. "Very well, monsieur," he said. 9 o'clock, then, and we'll see if you'll talk as pertly afterwards." On that he flung away before the jeers of the provincial deputies. Nor did it soothe his rage to be laughed at by urchins all the way down the Rue Dauphine because of the mud and filth that dripped from his satin breeches and the tails of his elegant striped coat. But though the members of the Third had jeered on the surface, they trembled underneath with fear and indignation. It was too much. Legrand killed by one of these bullies, and now his successor challenged and about to be killed by another of them on the very first day of his appearance to take the dead man's place. Several came now to implore Andre-Louis not to go to the Bois, to ignore the challenge and the whole affair, which was but a deliberate attempt to put him out of the way. He listened seriously, shook his head gloomily, and promised at last to think it over. He was in his seat again for the afternoon session as if nothing disturbed him. But in the morning, when the assembly met, his place was vacant, and so was M. de Chabrien's. Gloom and resentment sat upon the members of the Third, and brought a more than usually acrid tone into their debates. They disapproved of the rashness of the new recruit to their body. Some openly condemned his lack of circumspection. Very few, and those only the little group in Le Chapelier's confidence, ever expected to see him again. It was, therefore, as much in amazement as in relief, that at a few minutes after 10 they saw him enter, calm, composed, and bland, and thread his way to his seat. The speaker occupying the rostrum at that moment, a member of the privileged, stopped short to stare in incredulous dismay. Here was something that he could not understand at all. Then, from somewhere, to satisfy the amazement on both sides of the assembly, a voice explained the phenomenon contemptuously. "They haven't met. He has shirked it at the last moment." It must be so, thought all. The mystification ceased, and men were settling back into their seats. But now, having reached his place, having heard the voice that explained the matter to the universal satisfaction, Andre-Louis paused before taking his seat. He felt it incumbent upon him to reveal the true fact. "Monsieur le Président, my excuses for my late arrival." There was no necessity for this. It was a mere piece of theatricality, such as it was not in Scaramouche's nature to forego. "I have been detained by an engagement of a pressing nature. I bring you also the excuses of M. de Chabrien. He, unfortunately, will be permanently absent from this assembly in future." The silence was complete. Andre-Louis sat down. Book 3, Chapter 8. The Paladin of the Third. Monsieur le Chevalier de Chabrien had been closely connected, you will remember, with the iniquitous affair in which Philippe de Vilmorin had lost his life. We know enough to justify a surmise that he had not merely been La Tour d'Azur's second in the encounter, but actually an instigator of the business. Andre-Louis may therefore have felt a justifiable satisfaction in offering up the Chevalier's life to the manes of his murdered friend. He may have viewed it as an act of common justice not to be procured by any other means. Also, it is to be remembered that Chabrien had gone confidently to the meeting, conceiving that he, a practised ferrier, had to deal with a bourgeois utterly unskilled in swordsmanship. Morally, then, he was little better than a murderer, and that he should have tumbled into the pit he conceived that he dug for Andre-Louis was a poetic retribution. Yet notwithstanding all this, I should find the cynical note on which Andre-Louis announced the issue to the assembly utterly detestable, did I believe it sincere. It would justify Aline of the expressed opinion which she held in common with so many others who had come into close contact with him, that Andre-Louis was quite heartless. You have seen something of the same heartlessness in his conduct when he discovered the faithlessness of La Binet, although that is belied by the measures he took to avenge himself. His subsequent contempt of the woman I account to be born of the affection in which for a time he held her. That this affection was as deep as he first imagined, I do not believe, but that it was as shallow as he would almost be at pains to make it appear by the completeness with which he affects to have put her from his mind when he discovered her worthlessness, I do not believe. Nor, as I have said, do his actions encourage that belief. Then again, his callous cynicism in hoping that he had killed Binet is also an affectation. Knowing that such things as Binet are better out of the world, he can have suffered no compunction. He had, you must remember, that rarely level vision which sees things in their just proportions, and never either magnifies or reduces them by sentimental considerations. At the same time, that he should contemplate the taking of life with such complete and cynical equanimity, whatever the justification, is quite incredible. Similarly now, it is not to be believed that in coming straight from the Bois de Boulogne, straight from the killing of a man, he should be sincerely expressing his nature in alluding to the fact in terms of such outrageous flippancy. Not quite to such an extent was he the incarnation of Scaramouche, but sufficiently was he so ever to mask his true feelings by an arresting gesture, his true thoughts by an effective phrase. He was the actor, always, a man ever calculating the effect he would produce, ever avoiding self-revelation, ever concerned to overlay his real character by an assumed and quite fictitious one. There was in this something of impishness, and something of other things. Nobody laughed now at his flippancy. He did not intend that anybody should. He intended to be terrible, and he knew that the more flippant and casual his tone, the more terrible would be its effect. He produced exactly the effect he desired. What followed in a place where feelings and practices had become what they had become is not difficult to surmise. When the session rose, there was a dozen spadasins awaiting him in the vestibule, and this time the men of his own party were less concerned to guard him. He seemed so entirely capable of guarding himself. He appeared, for all his circumspection, to have so completely carried the war into the enemy's camp, so completely to have adopted their own methods, that his fellows scarcely felt the need to protect him as yesterday. As he emerged, he scanned that hostile file, whose air and garments marked them so clearly for what they were. He paused, seeking the man he expected, the man he was anxious to oblige. But M. de La Tour d'Azyr was absent from those eager ranks. This seemed to him odd. La Tour d'Azyr was Chabrien's cousin and closest friend. Surely he should have been among the first today. The fact was that La Tour d'Azyr was too deeply overcome by amazement and grief at the utterly unexpected event. Also, his vindictiveness was held curiously in leash. Perhaps he, too, remembered the part played by Chabrien in the affair at Gavrillac, and saw in this obscure Andre-Louis Moreau, who had so persistently persecuted him ever since, an ordained avenger. The repugnance he felt to come to the point with him, particularly after this culminating provocation, was puzzling even to himself. But it existed, and it curbed him now. To Andre-Louis, since La Tour was not one of that waiting pack, it mattered little on that Tuesday morning who should be the next. The next, as it happened, was the young Vicomte de la Motte Royau, one of the deadliest blades in the group. On the Wednesday morning, coming again an hour or so late to the assembly, Andre-Louis announced, in much the same terms as he had announced the death of Chabrillane, that Monsieur de la Motte Royau would probably not disturb the harmony of the assembly for some weeks to come, assuming that he were so fortunate as to recover ultimately from the effects of an unpleasant accident, with which he had quite unexpectedly had the misfortune to meet that morning. On Thursday, he made an identical announcement with regard to the Vidame de Blavon. On Friday, he told them that he had been delayed by Monsieur de Troisquintin, and then, turning to the members of the Côte Droit, and lengthening his face to a sympathetic gravity, "I am glad to inform you, messieurs, that Monsieur de Troisquintin is in the hands of a very competent surgeon, who hopes with care to restore him to your counsels in a few weeks' time." It was paralyzing, fantastic, unreal, and friend and foe in that assembly sat alike stupefied under those bland daily announcements. 4 of the most redoubtable spadacinicides put away for a time, one of them dead, and all this performed with such an air of indifference and announced in such casual terms by a wretched little provincial lawyer. He began to assume in their eyes a romantic aspect. Even that group of philosophers of the Côte Gauche, who refused to worship any force but the force of reason, began to look upon him with a respect and consideration which no oratorical triumphs could ever have procured him. And from the assembly, the fame of him oozed out gradually over Paris. Desmoulins wrote a panegyric upon him in his paper Les Révolutions, wherein he dubbed him the Paladin of the Third Estate, a name that caught the fancy of the people and clung to him for some time. Disdainfully was he mentioned in the Acte d'Apôtre, the mocking organ of the privileged party, so light-heartedly and provocatively edited by a group of gentlemen afflicted by a singular mental myopy. The Friday of that very busy week in the life of this young man, who even thereafter is to persist in reminding us that he is not in any sense a man of action, found the vestibule of the manège empty of swordsmen when he made his leisurely and expectant egress between Le Chapelier and Kersain. So surprised was he that he checked in his stride. "Have they had enough?" he wondered, addressing the question to Le Chapelier. "They have had enough of you, I think," was the answer. "They will prefer to turn their attention to someone less able to take care of himself." Now this was disappointing. Andre-Louis had lent himself to this business with a very definite object in view. The slaying of Chabrillane had, as far as it went, been satisfactory. He had regarded that as a sort of acceptable hors d'oeuvre. But the 3 who had followed were no affair of his at all. He had met them with a certain amount of repugnance, and dealt with each as lightly as consideration of his own safety permitted. Was the baiting of him now to cease, whilst the man at whom he aimed had not presented himself? In that case, it would be necessary to force the pace. Out there under the awning, a group of gentlemen stood in earnest talk. Scanning the group in a rapid glance, Andre-Louis perceived M. de La Tour d'Azyr amongst them. He tightened his lips. He must afford no provocation. It must be for them to fasten their quarrels upon him. Already the Acte des Apôtres that morning had torn the mask from his face and proclaimed him the fencing master of the Rue de Hasard, successor to Bertrand des Amis. Hazardous as it had been hitherto for a man of his condition to engage in single combat, it was rendered doubly so by this exposure, offered to the public as an aristocratic apologia. Still, matters could not be left where they were, or he should have had all his pains for nothing. Carefully looking away from that group of gentlemen, he raised his voice so that his words must carry to their ears. "It begins to look as if my fears of having to spend the remainder of my days in the Bois were idle." Out of the corner of his eye, he caught the stir his words created in that group. Its members had turned to look at him, but for the moment that was all. A little more was necessary. Pacing slowly along between his friends, he resumed. "But is it not remarkable that the assassin of Legrand should make no move against Legrand's successor? Or perhaps it is not remarkable. Perhaps there are good reasons. Perhaps the gentleman is prudent." He had passed the group by now, and he left that last sentence of his to trail behind him, and after it sent laughter, insolent and provoking. He had not long to wait. Came a quick step behind him, and a hand falling upon his shoulder spun him violently round. He was brought face to face with M. de La Tour d'Azyr, whose handsome countenance was calm and composed, but whose eyes reflected something of the sudden blaze of passion stirring in him. Behind him several members of the group were approaching more slowly. The others, like Andre-Louis' two companions, remained at gaze. "You spoke of me, I think," said the Marquis quietly. "I spoke of an assassin? Yes, but to these my friends." Andre-Louis' manner was no less quiet. Indeed, the quieter of the two, for he was the more experienced actor. "You spoke loudly enough to be overheard," said the Marquis, answering the insinuation that he had been eavesdropping. "Those who wish to overhear frequently contrive to do so. I perceive that it is your aim to be offensive." "Oh, but you are mistaken, Monsieur le Marquis. I have no wish to be offensive. But I resent having hands violently laid upon me, especially when they are hands that I cannot consider clean. In the circumstances, I can hardly be expected to be polite." The elder man's eyelids flickered. Almost he caught himself admiring Andre-Louis' bearing. Rather, he feared that his own must suffer by comparison. Because of this, he enraged altogether and lost control of himself. "You spoke of me as the assassin of Legrand. I do not affect to misunderstand you. You expounded your views to me once before, and I remember." "But what flattery, monsieur!" "You called me an assassin then, because I used my skill to dispose of a turbulent hothead who made the world unsafe for me. But how much better are you, Monsieur the fencing master, when you oppose yourself to men whose skill is as naturally inferior to your own." M. de La Tour d'Azyr's friends looked grave, perturbed. It was really incredible to find this great gentleman so far forgetting himself as to descend to argument with a canaille of a lawyer swordsman, and what was worse, it was an argument in which he was being made ridiculous. "I oppose myself to them?" said Andre-Louis in a tone of amused protest. "Ah, pardon, Monsieur le Marquis, it is they who chose to oppose themselves to me, and so stupidly. They push me, they slap my face, they tread on my toes, they call me by unpleasant names. What if I am a fencing master? Must I, on that account, submit to every manner of ill treatment from your bad-mannered friends? Perhaps had they found out sooner that I am a fencing master, their manners would have been better. But to blame me for that? What injustice!" "Comedian!" the Marquis contemptuously apostrophized him. "Does it alter the case? Are these men who have opposed you men who live by the sword like yourself?" "On the contrary, Monsieur le Marquis, I have found them men who died by the sword with astonishing ease. I cannot suppose that you desire to add yourself to their number." "And why, if you please?" La Tour d'Azyr's face had flamed scarlet before that sneer. "Oh," Andre-Louis raised his eyebrows and pursed his lips a man considering. He delivered himself slowly. "Because, monsieur, you prefer the easy victim, the Legrands and Villemorins of this world, mere sheep for your butchering. That is why." And then the Marquis struck him. Andre-Louis stepped back. His eyes gleamed a moment. The next, they were smiling up into the face of his tall enemy. No better than the others, after all. Well, well. Remark, I beg you, how history repeats itself, with certain differences. Because poor Vilmorin could not bear a vile lie with which you goaded him, he struck you. Because you cannot bear an equally vile truth which I have uttered, you strike me. But always is the vileness yours. And now, as then, for the striker there is..." He broke off. "But why name it? You will remember what there is. Yourself you wrote it that day with the point of your too-ready sword. But there, I will meet you if you desire it, monsieur." "What else do you suppose that I desire? To talk?" Andre-Louis turned to his friends and sighed. "So that I am to go another jaunt to the Bois. Isaac, perhaps you will kindly have a word with one of these friends of Monsieur le Marquis and arrange for 9 o'clock tomorrow, as usual." "Not tomorrow," said the Marquis shortly to Le Chapelier. "I have an engagement in the country, which I cannot postpone." Le Chapelier looked at Andre-Louis. "Then, for Monsieur le Marquis's convenience, we will say Sunday, at the same hour." "I do not fight on Sunday. I am not a pagan to break the holy day." "But surely the good God would not have the presumption to damn a gentleman of Monsieur le Marquis's quality on that account." "Ah, well, Isaac, please arrange for Monday, if it is not a feast day, or monsieur has not some other pressing engagement. I leave it in your hands." He bowed with the air of a man wearied by these details, and threading his arm through Kersain's, withdrew. "Ah, Dieu de Dieu! But what a trick of it you have!" said the Breton deputy, entirely unsophisticated in these matters. "To be sure I have. I have taken lessons at their hands." He laughed. He was in excellent good humour, and Kersain was enrolled in the ranks of those who accounted Andre-Louis a man without heart or conscience. But in his Confessions he tells us, and this is one of the glimpses that reveal the true man under all that make-believe, that on that night he went down on his knees to commune with his dead friend Philippe, and to call his spirit to witness that he was about to take the last step in the fulfillment of the oath sworn upon his body at Gavrillac 2 years ago.